Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of Tech Bytes. This week we have Kate Johnson. She's the Senior Web Content Strategist at the University of Denver, and the title of her talk is Content Strategy in Real Life. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate your coming. I am so excited whenever anybody is interested in content and how it integrates with the web, because traditionally the model has been that you focus on IA and user experience and design, and then that very last step, even if you see the old diagrams, is content and sort of throwing the words into the boxes, which is hilarious to me because the words and the content are the whole reason the site exists. But still, that's the traditional way of looking at it. And so I'll just start off by talking about what content strategy is at all. And so content strategy it's blown up as a discipline. It didn't really exist 3 or 4 years ago maybe, and then just in the past couple of years suddenly you'll find it all over the web if you search it, and loads of consultants talking about being content strategists. And some of them fairly get the reputation of being people who talk about leveraging synergies and things like that a lot. And in fairness, some are. And there was one guy in my field who actually said to me once, what you do is great, it's fantastic and all, but when we get really busy, we may not have time for all that strategy sort of stuff. And those quotation marks were really there in his voice. And that kills me, because the strategy is really the very practical part about getting the work done. And I'm incredibly practical and not about being strategically focused or about writing a whole lot of strategic documents or anything. So if you did search it on the web, if you search content strategy, it would be easily understandable if you would tend to think these are people who create diagrams, because I have never seen such an infographic-loving group of people as content strategists, and the circles and the colors and everything. And some of the most fun I had was ever was Googling this and seeing how many popped up, and it was hundreds more or less. But as much as I think this is funny, there's a very real reason behind this, and that's that content is sort of intensely complicated. And it's almost kind of hard to articulate why it's so complicated until you actually jump in and try a project. And everything from collecting the information ahead of time to drafting the text to someone else doesn't like the text, and then you have to set up the video and you have to get stakeholder input, and it becomes quite a complicated process. And part of the reasons are all the multiple people across all these different kinds of disciplines that you have to get to come together and buy into content. In my particular case, in the higher ed world, that can sometimes be administrators and faculty who can have a very different sense of what makes for ideal web content than marketers can. There's all the different places you can be getting content from, whether it's photos and videos to who might be drafting content, whether they're a really seasoned writer or maybe they're a really seasoned academic writer, or it's not infrequent for us to have front desk people who, as maybe 1/10 of their time are scheduled to create web content. There's all the places you publish out to, goes way beyond text pages. You also have social media, podcasts. You might push things out to an email newsletter, so you have to be keeping all of that in mind. And maintenance I'll talk about a little bit more later, but the sort of ongoing care and feeding of a site really wasn't even in the past considered as part of creating a website. It was just launch and go. And so that's an aspect that content strategy has started to focus on. And there's measuring success, which also was never really an issue before with content. You can go on and on in the way that all this becomes complicated. And so what content strategists are really here for is that they look at this big sort of tangled mass of different skill sets that people need, and disciplines and priorities and timelines. And one of the first things content strategy did was recognize, this is just complicated. Content is messy, and that doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. It's just part of the inherent contentness of content. And so what we need to do is start looking at it and trying to pick it apart into certain specific processes and steps, so that you're not sitting down every time and from scratch saying, all right, I need some words, let's go from there. So this is one of the best known content strategy diagrams. I just wanted to show you, in the sense it helps you visualize a little how content strategy kind of imagines itself, that you can come from these different directions, from technical and editorial and strategy. And I know you can't read the individual sections too well, but where I would fall is right in between editorial and strategy. I come from an editorial background, and then I've picked up web planning as I go. And so here it's what they would call web editor-in-chief, is basically me. But you also have to have the technical elements in terms of understanding what your technical capabilities mean in terms of the content that you can do, and vice versa. So again, the sense here is that it's very complicated and it's all very interrelated. So what I'm here to talk about, though, isn't the strategy of it so much, because you could go on and on for hours, really, of all the different factors involved, from audience and analysis and creating personas and things like messaging hierarchies. And so you could go on forever, and it's not what I find the most interesting anyway. I'm really going to talk about the real life part of things, which is how I took all these strategy ideas and applied them to use sort of real life content and website issues. And I'm going to show you a couple of specific tools I created, and at the end there's a website that I'll give you the address for in case you have any interest in going back and referencing them and looking at them in some more detail. This is the one really horrific infographic that I've created, the one and only, and this gives you a sense of the basic elements of our content process that I put together, and that really actually drafting the content, editing it, is only this one chunk of it, and there's so much more. I won't talk to you too much about prioritizing, because it doesn't apply too much in this case, but it comes up a lot with us in that we're often having so many projects. We might have a couple of dozen on our plate at the same time in different stages of the process. And so we had to create a process that was extremely scalable. And so for the projects that are very high priority and they're very large, we can spend a lot of time going in detail through the same steps. But we have to be able to apply the same steps to very small projects as well, just sort of in different levels of intensity and different amounts of time that we devote to them. Oh, and so so I work in marketing and communications here, and along with ourselves creating some central websites, we also serve other departments all across campus. Mortgage is one of them, who are working on their own websites, and we consider them clients. They're our internal clients. So the way I'll be describing it here is how we go through the process with our clients, because it's a little easier to break it out that way. The steps are a little more discrete, but we follow exactly the same process when we're creating websites for ourselves within our department. So we created this project kickoff where right at the beginning we try and grab all the basic preliminary information that you need to have on hand later when you're building the site, one of which is the purpose, which honestly 10 years ago wouldn't really get discussed all that much. It would just be that we need a website, so therefore we're going to create a website. And this is also a place where we talk about stakeholders, which become incredibly important in terms of all the human factors that we have to take into account when it comes to content, which can be quite a lot, and the technical requirements, which again we try and get out ahead of in case our developers need more time, and also because they can affect the kind of content that we're even capable of doing. So I've created, it's just a Word document, and we have all our clients fill it out, and all these fields just give us the basic information that we need that we can refer back to later. Our next step is what we call our content IA kickoff meeting, and this is both a content and IA kickoff because the same factors influence the content as influence information architecture. Logically enough, if it influences what the content's going to be, probably also change the way you might organize it. And so we sit down at this point and try to do some more in-depth questions in terms of what audience might be, and then more specifically goals, instead of more generally why the site should exist. What are the very specific goals that you want to reach? We try to turn people toward being more task-focused also than pushing out message-focused. We start talking about branding. And this is also a point where we start brainstorming some metrics. I mean, this is relatively new here. I'm trying to get people to think about specifically how they're going to measure whether they're meeting these goals. Right, and we also need to talk about their staff resources at this point, because this is a place where people can be extremely unrealistic in terms of how long content really takes. And this helps us determine ahead of the IA stage of things how much content they can really realistically maintain. So we go through all this. We go to our information architecture stage. We do have a user experience designer on staff, and he primarily does the initial site maps, and then we all do a back and forth with them. But content does have a real role still in the IA process. I mean, one of the biggest ones being just your taxonomy, and we need to make sure that those labels are realistic, that they'll make sense to the audience. We might do some research in terms of whether people search those terms and so they're intuitive, things like that. We also might have a sense of types of content that our clients might want but never really occurred to them when they were working on their sitemap. And a big one for us is avoiding content that people can't actually keep up with, because that's such a common problem, I think, in higher ed a lot. You'll see it in other places as well, where you'll find pages that are 2 to 3 years out of date. And so we try and head that off ahead of time if we can, and then unnecessary content. You would be amazed that everyone really wants to put up a PDF of their brochure because their brochure is pretty, so they just want to put it up, or calendars from 4 or 5 years ago. It truly happens, and so we try and keep an eye out for content that actually can clutter things up and actually hurt the user experience. Got our IA established, everybody signed off on it, the client and our designer. And then this is where we go into the client coaching process. And this is another one of those infographics from the web, but it's meant to show just what the workflow basically is like. This is just a sole lonely content creator out there, and how you go from drafting to edits and approvals, and back to drafting and edits and approvals, and this can become a process, a loop that can go on forever if you don't, if you allow it to. To help keep that from happening, we coach clients on content workflows. So we help them set up the actual process that they use in their content creation and vetting and approval and everything. And it can vary so wildly from department to department that we work for, depending on everything from who's writing their content, how much of it is technical, how much of it is multimedia, who all they need to approve and edit things. And it's a very customized sort of situation. And so we'll actually sit there with them and say, you know, in terms of the human factors, all right, do you know you have this approver who will tend to not approve anything at all, or will tend to take a very long time with it? Then you need to over budget your time there. Or do you have multiple writers or editors, things have to go through, and this is how you can chunk up your content and move it around and get it through your process. So we help them set this up and figure out the order it'll go through. And then we have them map it against their content inventory. And content inventories are my very favoriteest thing of all time, and I love them, and they help clients a lot. And there's a lot of different formats that you'll see these in. For us, it's been so easy to just have it be a spreadsheet. Every page on your spreadsheet, every page on your site is a row on your spreadsheet, and across the columns there's so much flexibility to track anything that you might need to know about that for inside your team that's working on the site, or that people who are going in and you know, populating their site in the CMS that they may need to look back to. And so this is where you'll see how we track their process across here, where if they have multiple writers, they'll use a column for that, and multiple approvers, and so on and so forth. And then this maintenance section, I'll harp on maintenance a lot because it's become so important. But we ask them this far ahead of time to, when they're looking at every page, look at the content on that page and how frequently will it really need to be updated. And that's here partly because it's a great resource later after launch when they need to go back and look at their update schedule, but also it's very helpful for us to have them looking at this ahead of time and seeing what kind of a time investment there will be in their content, and maybe altering it if they need to. And so if I can get, clients can be a little intimidated by this sometimes because it's a spreadsheet and there's a lot of columns. But the ones who have gotten comfortable with it afterwards will always tell me that they love it and they wish they'd spent more time investing in it. That's maybe the second part of our coaching, is getting their inventory set up for them. And we've created what we call a page template. And so you know, the way it works with our clients is that we just don't have the time and the resources to be writing content for everybody around the campus. Very, very rarely do we actually write pages. And so we're coaching them, we're consulting with them to help them be able to create their content, and then when they build their site in the content management system, our developers will build the skeleton, but they are entirely responsible for populating when we get to that point. So I found that we used to get content sent to us in all these crazy different formats with pieces missing. So I've just created this Word document where there's a field for every bit of content that they're going to need. From the simple metadata, and for example, alt tags down there. No one will ever think of alt tags for images unless you force them to. And we'll make sure they have a headline and the content. If there's any sort of sidebar or off to the rail content, we get them to note it here. This is really something that theoretically you could also do inside the content inventory. I've seen some people do all their metadata there, and mostly it's just because they're composing their actual content here that we just keep it in Word, and it's worked just fine for us. So that's all the consulting we do with them on process. And then our next step is actually training them in how you write for the web, which is this entirely different discipline than writing for print. And it can take a lot of training. So we do a lot of in-person group and sometimes one-on-one training sessions. And then we put the seminar up on YouTube. You'll have a link to it, so you'll be able to watch it if you like. Fair warning, the visuals are pretty out of date and I really need to update it. But we get a lot of mileage about showing them the eye tracking maps, the Nielsen maps, anything that helps them actually visualize the way the eye jumps around the page and does not read from line to line. And that, more than any amount of telling people things, can help them get into the mindset of chunking things up and subheads and sidebars and that kinds of thing. And, we've created a style guide for them. This is just pretty much a must-have for web content, a content strategist, especially in an institution as large as ours is, which is so decentralized. And part of the way for people to see us as a unified organization isn't just how visually our websites track and look similar, but also just content-wise, how we handle certain things. And so some of these are about consistency, and some of them are just about good web practice. We say things here like, don't make click here link, and don't paste huge, complicated URLs directly into page text, things like that. So this is a content tool that just about any organization should have. And I started developing these content models because at a certain point I realized that similar types of sites require similar types of content frequently. And why should I ask these people to be drafting this content from scratch every single time? I mean, partly it's extremely time consuming and hard, and partly you don't get consistency and quality necessarily. So just one example of these is these faculty profile pages. So we took a look at the kind of information that tends to be effective across the board and other examples from other institutions of how we do these. And so we've given them a fill-in-the-blanks model here, where we show them the required information, how we would tend to organize it, the kinds of content that's optional and a great addition, and the kind that they should only add if they have the time to update it. And I will say with all of our clients, we are not a prescriptive organization. We aren't the boss and we can't tell people exactly what to do. So instead we're in much more of a encouraging and convincing kind of a role. So we try and use tools like these to show them the value and how easy we can make web content if they work along with us and follow our advice. So that's basically all the prepping them for content that we do. And just our team rolls through the rest of the process to get to launch. We edit, they enter content, we launch. Clients are very excited, we're all very excited. Then there's this post-launch segment, which again is a pretty new creation. And I've just had our team started doing it in the past year, 2 years. And it's this idea that you're trying to train people that it's not a print publication, that it's not just launch it and leave it, that there's really this ongoing life cycle of a website, of posting and then measuring success and then altering a little and measuring success, and it just goes on and on forever. And so we work with clients to try and get them to set up a very regular, very defined update schedule, and that content inventory from back then makes that very helpful. Most of your CMSs now will send you automatic email reminders, which our new one now does on the update, and we love it and it's fantastic. So we encourage them to set that up, and then we try really hard to ask all our clients to at least once a year do a full review of all the content on their site, and they don't like it because it's time consuming. But it's so easy for you to find pages on your site there that are 3 years out of date because you never really stop to look at them. And there are all these pieces of content that you may not originally think about when you create the page, but that may start to get out of date, like your list of faculty members if someone leaves, or even things like photos with the way people are dressed and their hair, which can subtly start getting out of date in a year or two, and people may not catch it. And there's a photo from '95 and it just does not look, it looks funky. And finally, also a relatively new thing I've tried to bring in with our client sites is just setting metrics and measurement. And that's trying to find ways to judge the success of content. And that's a much trickier thing than sort of the way traditionally they've used analytics and A/B testing and things like that to test the success of, say, user experience or design. It's relatively easy to do an A/B test and see whether your red button or your blue button is more successful at pushing people to the next page. But then how you decide whether a certain page of content is working for you or not, it takes some creative thinking, which is why I kind of like it. So we try and look back at their very specific site goals that they have and figure out what measurements will really tell us if they're meeting those. And they may be the kind of analytics that we're used to. If it's about getting more, it's about having better SEO, then you look at how much organic traffic you bring to your site for certain search terms. If your site goal is trying to get information out to people easily so they can understand it, maybe you could look at the number of phone calls that your front desk staff is taking about questions that people should be able to answer on your website. And so if those go down, you're being successful. And I'm thinking, skip being specific and actionable, and that's that when you talk about goals initially, always the goal will be raising our applications to the program, raising our donations, raising our purchases. And these are all excellent goals. This is exactly what they want to do, but it's the actionable part that gets so tricky. And so if your applications go down this year, what is it that you do about that on the website? What's the thing that you fix that solves that problem? Especially when there are factors outside of the website that can affect it. And you can't perfectly measure any of this, but as much as you can try to hone it down to specific places. For example, from a particular page, how many of your people do you push to the type of content that you want them to go to, then what page you want them to go to. So with sort of content marketing, the kind of things we do with prospective students, it can be more complicated than that because they may not go from the exact page they're reading straight to, say, applying. There may be a long path in between there that we can't really track with analytics, so we try and do things like ratios. What's the ratio of people who read this particular page, this entry-level page, to the number who ultimately applied? And if you see that ratio dropping, right? If you see the ratio going down, then that's one sign that you're being successful. And so you need more than one metric because none of them are perfect, and they're all, somebody call them fuzzy. All analytics are fuzzy to a certain extent. But you can use them to just get a snapshot of how things are going and continue to, iterate your site. That covers our process. And here's the URL to a page I built that has all these tools if you find them helpful. I built it for another conference for High Ed Web, but they're all there for download. And that's it. Thank you. Did any questions come up?
Credentials.
There are none so far, really.
Okay.
There aren't. There have been articles about that. How do you become a content strategist? Where do they come from? And right now, if you remember the big honeycomb, they come from so many different directions. And there are people who are copywriters, or I was a print and web editor, and then there were you know, people who are in IA but have a love for content. And so there really is there's no certificate or degree that you can get in it right now. You just have to, you know, if you're looking for one, you have to look for people who are smart and have all their background, you know, in the organization and structure and the way the web works, and then understand well what makes content good. So it's sort of part of the reason it's a new field, I think, is because it has this sort of diverse set of skills it addresses that never really came together before.
And who has to wait. I mean, it must be difficult.
Extremely difficult. You know, it's one of the bigger problems we face. And then there's our own internal sites, which are also top priority. And mostly we try and do our best to fight the good fight and base it on university priorities, which tend to be things like bringing in students. So academic units tend to be a high priority, and really identity and brand establishing kind of things. You know, every once in a while you lose the good fight, and because it's somebody important's pet project, you do it then. But it really is kind of a crazy balance trying to keep all the different, you know, different stages of the process with so many different clients and different types of clients that that's a huge challenge. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's both good questions. So the first one, if I understand right, you're talking about user submitted content, things like. I see. And that's going to vary a lot, I think, depending on your workflow. We do in our office, well, we have this editing phase we go through, where we mostly it becomes a matter of providing advice, and we make recommendations about chunking's a big one, you know, chunk things up, and simpler voice and tone. When we can and when the client is open to that, we actually will go in and light edit things or try and draft parts of higher level pages which need more marketing attention than the lower level, more detailed factual pages. And so we do some of that, and it's part of that scalable thing. It varies a lot depending on how big the project is and what kind of priority level they're at. And at what point we work with the information architect. So we collaborate at that initial point where we have the information gathering stage. And then generally the way it works is he goes off separately and creates a first round sitemap. Sometimes we're talking at that point, but usually more realistically in terms of time. He goes off and he creates a sitemap and he brings it back, and we look at it at the same time as the client looks at the first round of it. And so that's the point where we start going back and forth. And sometimes there can be a lot of back and forth because we don't like this particular, we don't think this particular label works, or we don't think content works there, and so we can butt heads for a while sometimes. But it is really collaborative, and I think any team that's working the content in IA is very collaborative. Welcome. All right. Nope. We're good. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Sorry.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time.